Yes, hello to you all once again, and a very warm welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel here on YouTube. And it's your host Chris here again with more of those long lost vintage dirt bikes for you to take a look at here on my channel. Now this next featured machine is another quite rare Italian stallion, and we have already featured a couple of these bikes here on CDB TV, but this is another rare bike from the early 1980s, and these particular Italian bikes were very popular in their native Italy, but not so many were seen over here in the UK, and in fact internationally they were virtually unheard of. But we're going to take a look at one now, and this particular bike belongs to Paul Martin. So let's dive straight into that video and take a look at this 1982 Ancillotti Pull Shock 250. So the history of the Ancillotti company dates back to the 19th century, when its then founder Ernesto Ancillotti, who graduated from being a driver of early horse-drawn carriages to start up what was at that time one of the first public transport companies in Florence at the beginning of the 20th century. So it was really inevitable that when motorised transport came along, Ernesto would then open up a workshop for the repair and the maintenance of these brand new vehicles, with initially concentrating of course on cars before then moving on to motorcycles. But it was Ernesto's son Gualtiero who was fascinated by these new two-wheeled motorcycles, and in the early 1950s he designed a chassis for the two-cylinder Harley Davidson that was based on models that were used for the US Army at that time. Now, in the early 1960s, go-kart racing came to Europe, and Ernesto designed various frames and transmission systems to power and control these small four-wheeled racing cars. But to cut a long story short, in the coming years, Ancillotti would go on to design other things like tuning kits for the Italian Lambretta scooters, and they also performed modifications and tuning to the German-made Sachs engines in the 1970s. And after the passing of the company's founder Ernesto in 1973, then the day-to-day running of the company was then taken over by his two sons Alberto and Piero, who then went on to produce some very fine competition motorcycles in the late 1970s and early 80s, before of course then moving on to produce some of the finest mountain and adventure bicycles that we know today. But of course, as with many of the other smaller European motorcycle manufacturers of the 1970s and 80s, companies like Ancillotti just couldn't compete with the might of the big four companies like Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki and Yamaha when it came to performance, price and volume of machines. And in the mid 1980s, their factory at Sambuca Valdepesa closed its production of motorcycles. Which brings us around to our featured machine. So what we have here is a 1982 Ancillotti 250, although this particular bike here was actually manufactured in late 1981, and it's not 100% original for that year, although this bike has certainly undergone a recent restoration by Paul Martin, whose father Keith was actually the official UK importer of Italian Ancillottis into Great Britain during the 1980s, and it's said that this actual bike here was raced in the UK at that time by northeast of England rider Malcolm Lee, who sadly is no longer with us. But after Malcolm's passing, this bike lay under a cover in a barn for many years until a chance meeting between the Martin family and Malcolm's parents when the subject of this old race bike re-emerged, where it was then rediscovered in a very sorry state and subsequently then purchased by Paul Martin, where Paul performed a full refurbishment of the bike to bring it back to the condition that you now see in these video clips and pictures. So when Paul first began this bike's restoration, he knew that it wasn't going to be a simple, straightforward process, mainly because 1982 Ancillotti spare parts aren't exactly freely available in this modern day, but Paul was certainly going to do the best he could with what parts were still usable, and others that he couldn't refurbish or restore, then he'd just have to replace them with a modern day equivalent. But Paul's goal was to bring the bike back to life and do a few classic races on the bike, and hopefully honour the memory of the Ancillotti's previous owner and racer, Malcolm Lee. And so to begin, Paul stripped the Ancillotti down to the sum of its parts, and starting with the bike's frame, it was inspected for any signs of damage or wear before then being stripped of its old 1980s patina by sandblasting, and then finally repainting it in this hard-wearing powder-coated black. But these Ancillotti frames were quite well designed and very strong for their time, and they were made from light gauge tubular steel and perfectly suited as a light two-stroke motocross chassis, which of course made our little Italian stallion very quick and flickable when it was out there on the track. Now, some of the earlier 1980s Ancillotti motocrossers were fitted with an Italian-made Hyro two-stroke engine, although, as you can see, our Ancillotti here has a different Italian power plant in this Motovilla two-stroke engine, which again was a superb motor that wasn't just used in Motovilla off-road motocross bikes, but this engine here was also used to power four-wheeled racing go-karts, which was a hugely popular sport in the 70s and 1980s. But this Motovilla 250 two-stroker was a simple reed valve engine that had a 6-speed transmission and your standard wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch. And most of these Villa engines had these quite large cylinder and head cooling fins to naturally dissipate heat from the motor more efficiently. Now, to feed our Motovilla engine with its pre-mixed fuel, it was a quite sizable 38mm Type 54 Bing carburetor that was used to supply its fuel-air mixture into the cylinder. But these big Bing carburetors are still perfect for these smaller two-stroke motors, and some owners do tend to swap these for a more modern Mikuni or something similar. But for me, personally speaking, as long as you take the time to set these Bing carburetors up correctly with regards their jetting and air mixture settings, then these carburetors are every bit as good as any modern day Japanese equivalent. And so the air intake into the Bing carburetor was kind of angled here to fit around the bike's rear single shock, and this rubber elbow was fixed onto a plastic airbox that was located underneath the bike seat. Now, Paul did tell me on the day that this airbox here isn't the original design that was fitted to this bike back in 1982, and that you had to do a slight bit of redesigning of this particular part, which I'm assuming was because the bike's stock 82 item was maybe either damaged or missing altogether. But either way, it still looks almost correct on this rare Italian bike, and unless you're an Ancillotti encyclopedia on all of your motocross models, then I expect that your average viewer would probably not even notice the difference. But moving on to the exhaust system on our Moto Vila engine. Now, as far as I'm aware, this Ancillotti still has its original 1982 exhaust expansion chamber, which I have to say is still in excellent condition for a bike that's more than 40 years old now. But on the other hand, this pipe, of course, could either be a new old stock replacement, or it's maybe enjoyed a charmed life while it was on the track, because it doesn't look like it's been battered by any debris from the racetrack. But then again, Paul could have, of course, refurbished this pipe as part of the bike's restoration. But the bike's tailpipe, without question, is the correct part for our Ancillotti, with this Italian-made SEM alloy unit, and these SEM products were fitted to quite a few of the Italian off-road motocrossers of their day, including Cagivas and TGMs and a few others. But these were very light, as you'd expect, being made from alloy, and they were all fully rebuildable with regards any maintenance and silencer repacking was concerned. Now, on this right-hand side of the engine clutch casing, the Moto Vila brand name, as you can see, has been machined off, probably just to try and keep you thinking that this is still Ancillotti's own home-built engine. But on this left-hand side, the CDI ignition cover, which originally would have had Vila casted onto the cover, is now been replaced with a substitute Ancillotti Moto Italia emblem instead. Although for its time, I have to say, this early 1980s Moto Vila engine was still a very good power plant that reputedly knocked out around the 39 horsepower mark, which, to be fair, wasn't too bad for a smaller 250 engine. And as I mentioned, this engine was widely used on a variety of two and four-wheeled racers. So as you can see, it had a very good reputation for its power and overall reliability. Now, also during the bike's refurbishment, Paul stripped down the bike's front end, and he also treated it to a full rebuild with brand new internals, and the Marzocchi's 40mm inside stanchions were also re-chromed, although naturally you just can't see that particular part of the refurbishment due to these new rubber fork gaiters. But once again, more Italian manufactured parts that are bolted onto our bike, and these Marzocchis were certainly put to good use on many other off-road bikes of the late 1970s and early 80s, and these forks were very popular suspension systems for their time. Now, the hubs on our 250 Ancillotti were Grimeka parts, and on this front brake here, it was just a simple old school drum brake that had the job of slowing or stopping our 250. And again here at the back, it was also a Mica rear hub with that simple drum brake and shoe stopping system. But it was quite unusual to see one of these European off-road motocrossers with these old school drum brakes still being used in 1982, because there was already quite a few manufacturers who had made the switch to more modern style hydraulic disc brakes by the end of the 1980s. So with regards to the bike's front and rear wheels, which of course are not the originals, but these are brand new replacements, because Paul said that the bike's originals were just too far gone and too dangerous to be used on an off-road race bike. So these nice gold anodized alloy wheels were then relaced with brand new spokes onto the bike's original 1982 Mica hubs. And all of this new wheel building and respoking was all done by the talented hands of Roy Thursby, who stripped down the old wheels to replace with this new shiny pair of Goldies. Right, so as we move on to the Ancillotti's rear suspension, which I'm pretty sure in 1982 would have had an Italian-made Corticoso rear shock fitted here, which, to be fair, weren't the very best and never had a good reputation for their function and quality. So thankfully Paul's now substituted that particular part for a top-of-the-range Swedish-made Öhlins shock, complete of course with its remote gas and oil reservoir there as well. But these Öhlins are superb quality, highly tunable for adjustments to the rebound and damping, and they're also fully rebuildable with regards any maintenance or servicing that's required. But it was thanks to the guys at Kai's Suspension who built this Öhlins shock specifically for our Italian Ancillotti. But as you can see, these Ancillottis had just a simple box section rear swing arm, which more often than not came from the Ancillotti factory in this highly polished fashion, which was a bit of a trademark on these Italian-made alloy swing arms during the 1980s. But as you can see, even Ancillotti had a brand name for their rear suspension system, because Suzuki of course had the full floater, Honda had the ProLink, and Yamaha had the monocross system, and of course Kawasaki had their famous Unitrack rear suspension. So naturally the Europeans weren't going to be left out, so Ancillotti then called theirs the pull shock suspension system. But this Ancillotti pull shock suspension doesn't, as its name suggests, operate in the opposite direction to a normal suspension shock, whereby it pulls rather than compresses in the conventional manner. It's all really more to do with the way in which this kind of rising rate linkage works that connects the shock onto the chassis and swing arm. And actually derivatives of this pull shock system are still in use today on many of Ancillotti's high quality mountain bicycles that they produce and sell all over the globe. So as we move on to the bike's fuel tank, now with all off-road bikes of the 1980s, Ancillotti was certainly no different in the way that they constructed their fuel tanks, because plastic it was more or less your go-to material when it came to lightweight fuel storage systems of that era, and this tank here usually held more than enough premixed gas to keep our Moto Vila engine spinning on even the longest of race motocross events. But as you can guess, our 82's Ancillotti fuel cell underwent a bit of refurbishment when the rest of the bike was being taken care of, and MXM in Newcastle came up with some period correct 1982 style graphics to replace the tired and petrol stained originals that were on this tank previously, and these very high quality replacements are almost indistinguishable from the 1982 Italian originals. But without doubt, after the fuel tank's refurbishment, it was looking almost as good as new once again. Now, the bike's original seat, as you can imagine, wasn't in a very good state after its years of racing on the track, and then the bike being laid up and forgotten about for 20 or 30 years or so in an old garage. But it was suffice to say that the entire seat, apart from maybe its base, was unsuitable for reuse. But it's thanks again to the guys at MXM in Newcastle who came up with the parts that were needed to put it back to this condition. And you can see even in 1982 they were already designing these motocross racing seats that crept up at the rear of the bike's fuel tank, not only to help protect the rider's precious crown jewels, but of course to allow the rider to shift his weight from the back of the bike onto the front. But certainly the seat is now looking much better than it did before it's stripped down. And so as we come on to the plastics part of our Ancillotti, now although I was never actually told on the day, I'm pretty sure that the front and the rear mudguards on this bike are remanufactured replacements, but again they still look no different from the factory originals, and I expect that the plastics that were bolted onto the bike prior to its restoration would have been in a pretty sorry state after 40 odd years of track action. Although on this rear mudguard you can see that there's a generous bit of clearance there between that rear wheel and the mudguard itself. It's almost wide enough that you could drive a truck in between those two parts, but I can only imagine that the pull shock system would have had very little chance of bottoming out when the back end of this 250 encountered any jumps or bumps on the racetrack. But anyhow, the side panels that are bolted onto our Ancillotti chassis are once again the real deal from 1982, and these have been given some light refurbishment before being refitted with these new green number plate backgrounds. So although our 1982 Ancillotti is maybe not 100% original from its year of manufacture, it still has a big percentage of its factory parts still intact. And so as we move on to the pilot's seat and take a look at its controls now, most of these items are all replacements to the factory stock parts. So firstly we have a pair of Renthal handlebars there with its Renthal crossbar pad as well. Now the clutch and the brake levers and both handlebar grips are all quality Pro Taper parts, and these also have their gold anodized cable adjusters there as well. And as we move around to the control switch for that 250 Moto Vila engine, now this quality made Swedish Gunnar Gasser throttle twist grip rounds up what is a good assortment of controls for a rider to use when the bike gets back onto the track, which Paul hopes will be sooner rather than later. But at the end of the day, this is yet again another super rare Italian racer that's been brought back to life, thanks to the hard work of the bike's builder Paul Martin, and another piece of motocross racing history has been saved from obscurity. And as I said, these Italian Ancillottis were very popular in their native Italy in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but here in the UK and some other European countries, they were almost unheard of. But it was actually all down to this man here that we even saw an Ancillotti motocrosser here in the UK, because this is Keith Martin, who was the official importer of Ancillottis into the country when our Pull Shock 250 was being raced at local tracks by the late Malcolm Lee. And this is another nice picture here of father and son, with the bike's builder there, Paul, on the right, pictured with the 250 Pull Shock, and another rare Ancillotti Payu step-through kind of road bike. Although, as I said, these Ancillottis were very typical of the kind of bikes and the quality machines that some of the smaller Italian manufacturers were producing in those golden days of the 1970s and early 80s, although when the Japanese started to sell their cheaper, faster and high volume of machines into Europe during those decades, then the likes of smaller producers like Ancillotti had no way of competing on a level playing field. But it's thanks to their diversity and innovative ideas that Ancillotti, even here in 2023, are still regarded as one of the world's leaders in adventure and off-road bicycle manufacturing. And from what was initially a very scruffy and tired old motocrosser that had laid untouched for at least 2 decades, then Paul has certainly resurrected a very unique and rare Italian specimen, and I'm pretty sure that the bike's previous owner and racer, the late Malcolm Lee, will be justifiably proud of what Paul's done to his old and cherished race bike. So there you go, that's another quite rare Italian classic there, that 1982 Ancillotti 250 Pull Shock belonging to Paul Martin. So coming up next here on CDB TV, if you're into your 4-stroke thumpers, then you may like to retune to take a look at this lovely pair of John Hand 4-stroke Rotax racers, and this is a video that we did recently for the two brothers of Trevor and Malcolm Petrie, who are the owner of these two lovely bikes, and we did a small feature at the coast of Dunbar in Scotland on these two bikes just recently. So we'll be featuring both of the Petrie brothers 4-stroke thumpers in my next video posting here on CDB TV. So make sure you either subscribe or retune to take a look at that. But until the next time, thanks again for watching my video content, and we'll speak again very soon when we return to your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.